The hollow places. The fluorescent lights of the diner buzzed with that particular frequency that burrowed into the skull and made a home there, settling somewhere behind the eyes where exhaustion already lived. Wren Holloway stood behind the counter at 2:17 in the morning, her hands moving through the mechanical rhythm of wiping down surfaces that would never truly be clean. Her body operating on the kind of autopilot that came from working 3 jobs and sleeping 4 hours a night when she was lucky. The bills in her apron pocket, crumpled ones and fives that smelled like grease and desperation, amounted to $43, which meant she was still $62 short of rent, and Mrs. Catchpole had already given her 2 extensions this month. She counted the money again, as if the numbers might change through sheer force of will, as if hope could somehow multiply currency. But mathematics remained cruelly consistent, and the weight in her chest grew heavier with each recount. The streets outside were empty, the kind of empty that belonged to cities at the hour when even the desperate had gone home, when the darkness felt thick enough to touch, and Wren locked the diner door behind her with hands that trembled slightly from fatigue and something else, something she could never quite name. The walk back to her apartment took 20 minutes, through streets that smelled like rain and exhaust, past buildings that leaned together like tired sentries, and she kept her keys threaded through her fingers, the way she'd learned in a self-defense class she'd taken at the community center, back when she still believed preparation could prevent the inevitable. She'd been alone since she was 14, since the Richardsons had sat her down at their kitchen table and explained with faces full of pity and poorly concealed relief that they simply couldn't handle her anymore, that the incidents, they'd called them incidents, as if that word could soften the reality of doors torn from hinges, of nightmares that made her scream loud enough to crack windows, of the way their dog whimpered and hid whenever she entered a room, were too much for their family. They'd driven her back to the group home with her belongings and trash bags, and Mrs. Richardson had cried, but not enough to change her mind. Before the Richardsons, there had been the Kowalskis, and before them, the Mercers, and before them, a succession of temporary places filled with temporary people who looked at her like she was a problem to be solved or endure. The earliest memory she could grasp with any clarity began at age 10, waking in a hospital bed, with doctors shining lights in her eyes and asking her name, her parents' names, where she lived, and she'd had no answers, nothing but a vast empty space where her childhood should have been. They'd found her in the woods, hypothermic and alone, wearing a dirty nightgown, and despite searches and media coverage and investigation, no one ever came forward to claim her. The social workers had called it trauma-induced amnesia, had assured her the memories would return eventually, but 14 years later, her past remained a blank wall, and she'd stopped expecting it to be anything else. Her apartment was in the basement of a converted warehouse, the kind of space that was technically illegal to rent as residential, but existed in that gray area where desperation and willful ignorance intersected. The single room held a mattress on the floor, a hot plate, a mini fridge that rattled like it was trying to escape its own casing, and a bathroom so small she had to close the door to sit on the toilet. She'd covered the cracked concrete walls with fabric from thrift stores, had strung up fairy lights she'd found in someone's garbage, had tried to make it feel less like a cell, but at 2:47 in the morning, exhaustion stripped away all pretense, and she saw it for what it was, a hole where she waited between shifts. Wren barricaded the door, a habit she didn't break, a compulsion that felt necessary despite her inability to explain whom or what she was keeping out, and checked the single window that looked out at ankle level to the street above, where she could see the occasional flash of passing headlights. She kept a baseball bat next to her mattress, slept with her phone fully charged within reach, woke at every sound that filtered through the thin walls, and told herself this was normal city caution, not paranoia. Sleep, when it came, brought dreams of running through forests under moonlight, of freedom that tasted like winter air, of a belonging she'd never known in waking life, and she woke from these dreams with her heart racing and an ache in her chest that felt like grief for something she couldn't remember losing. The knock on her door at 7 in the morning jolted her from 3 hours of restless unconsciousness, and she grabbed the bat before her mind fully engaged, instinct moving her body into a defensive crouch that felt too natural, too practiced. But it was only Mrs. Catchpole, her landlady, standing in the hallway with her arms crossed and an expression that wasn't quite disapproval, wasn't quite concern, but lived somewhere in between. Vera Catchpole was the kind of woman who seemed to have been 55 for the past 2 decades, with silver-streaked hair always pulled into the same bun, dark eyes that noticed everything and commented on little, and the posture of someone who'd once held authority and hadn't entirely relinquished it. She looked at Wren now with an intensity that made the younger woman want to fidget, to explain herself, though she'd done nothing wrong. "You look half dead, girl," Vera said, which was as close to greeting as she typically offered. "You're working yourself into an early grave." "Rents do," Wren replied, because it was answer and explanation and excuse all at once. "I'm not here about rent." Vera glanced past Wren into the apartment, and something flickered across her face, something that might have been recognition or memory. "I'm here because you need to be careful. There have been reports of strange activity in the warehouse district, people going missing. The police aren't calling it a pattern yet, but I am." Wren had learned not to dismiss Vera the warnings. The older woman had lived in this neighborhood for 40 years and possessed the kind of situational awareness that came from surviving in places others fled. "I'm always careful," Wren said, which was true but also inadequate. Vera's expression suggested she wanted to say more, but she only nodded and turned to leave, pausing at the top of the stairs. "If you ever need anything, and I mean anything unusual, anything you can't explain through normal channels, you come to me first, understood?" It was a strange thing to say, specific in its vagueness, and Wren almost asked what she meant, but exhaustion made the question feel like too much effort, and she simply agreed before closing and re-barricading her door. She had 30 minutes before her shift at the coffee shop, which gave her time to shower in water that never quite got hot, to dress in clothes that smelled faintly of the lavender sachets she bought in bulk because they were cheap and made her feel like she was trying, to eat a protein bar that tasted like cardboard and promises of nutrition. Her reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror showed storm-gray eyes with shadows underneath that had become permanent fixtures, auburn hair that couldn't decide if it was brown or red, freckles across a nose that was slightly too sharp, and the kind of thinness that came from missing meals more often than eating them. The scar on her collarbone caught the light, a thin silver line about 2 inches long, perfectly straight, too precise to be accidental. She'd had it as long as she could remember, had asked doctors about it during those early years in foster care, and they'd theorized it was surgical, perhaps from some childhood operation, but without medical records, there was no way to know for certain. She pressed her fingers against it now, felt the slight ridge of scar tissue, and tried to ignore the way touching it always made her feel like she was forgetting something important, like there was a memory attached to the mark that remained frustratingly out of reach. The coffee shop shift passed in a blur of espresso machines and customer complaints, and the particular exhaustion that came from standing for 6 hours straight. Her manager, a perpetually stressed man named Derek who always smelled like cigarettes and energy drinks, asked if she could cover an evening shift next week, and she agreed because she always agreed, because saying no felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. It was during her 15-minute break, sitting in the alley behind the shop with a stale muffin and weak coffee, that she heard them. Children's voices, hushed and frightened, coming from the direction of the old warehouse complex that sprawled behind the commercial street like a corpse of industry, all broken windows and rusted metal, and spaces where people went to hide from the world or from themselves. Wren told herself to ignore it, to finish her break and go back inside where it was safe and warm, and none of her concern. She had enough problems without borrowing others. But her body was already moving, following the sound through a gap in the chain-link fence, through weeds that grew waist-high and reclaimed territory humans had abandoned, toward the largest of the warehouse structures. She found them in what had once been a loading bay, 5 children huddled together in the corner behind a pile of rotting pallets, and the sight of them hit her somewhere deep and primitive, somewhere that hurt with recognition she couldn't explain. They were filthy, dressed in clothes that had once belonged to someone else and had been outgrown or worn beyond repair. And they stared at her with eyes that held too much knowledge for their ages, the kind of wariness that came from learning early that adults brought pain more often than help. The oldest, a boy with brown hair falling into green eyes that seemed too old for his face, positioned himself in front of the others, his thin body in a protective stance that would have been admirable if it wasn't so heartbreaking. And the sound that came from his throat was wrong, too low and too animal to come from a human child. When the wolf came calling. 3 weeks transformed Wren's life in ways that defied explanation but felt inevitable, as if she'd been moving toward this peculiar constellation of responsibility since the moment she'd found those 5 frightened children huddled in the warehouse ruins. They'd followed her home that first day with the silent desperation of creatures who recognized safety when they saw it. And despite the rational part of her mind screaming about social services and proper procedures, and the fact that she could barely feed herself, she'd unlocked her basement apartment and let them inside, watching as they arranged themselves in her tiny space with the efficiency of those accustomed to making themselves small. Their names came gradually, offered like precious things that could be taken back if mishandled. Finn, the 11-year-old with watchful green eyes who'd appointed himself their guardian. Jory, 9 and fierce, with black curly hair and a suspicion of adults that manifested as aggressive silence. Pip, only 7, blonde and fragile-looking, but possessing a grip that left bruises when nightmares woke him. Tansy, 8, who noticed everything and spoke rarely but with devastating accuracy. And Beck, 10, whose scarred face suggested violence in his short past, and whose defensive posture never entirely relaxed. They wouldn't explain where they'd come from, and Wren discovered she couldn't bring herself to force the issue, recognizing in their traumatized silence something of her own fractured history, her own gaps and absences that resisted interrogation. She picked up extra hours at the diner, began stealing food systematically, packets of crackers, fruit that was approaching expiration, anything she could slip into her apron without Derek noticing, and taught the children to be silent during daylight hours when neighbors might hear, might question, might call authorities, who would separate them into the same system that had chewed Wren up and offered nothing but temporary placements and conditional acceptance. But there were things she couldn't ignore, disturbances that accumulated until denial became impossible. Finn's eyes reflecting light at night with an amber glow that didn't belong to human biology. Beck's fingernails that looked too sharp one morning and normal by afternoon. The way all 5 of them could hear things she couldn't, could smell things that made them tense before she registered any danger, could move with a coordination and speed that seemed physically improbable for malnourished children. And the growls, low and resonant, that emerged during their sleep, sounds that vibrated through her chest and made something deep inside her want to respond in kind. She told herself she was exhausted, that poverty and stress were creating hallucinations, that she was seeing patterns when none existed because her mind needed explanations for the inexplicable devotion she felt toward these 5 strangers who'd become her entire world in 21 days. The night everything changed began ordinarily enough, closing the diner at 2:17, counting money that still felt short of what she needed, walking through streets that smelled like imminent rain and urban decay. She took the alley shortcut, the one that saved 7 minutes, but sacrificed the illusion of safety that came with street lights and potential witnesses, and she was halfway through when they emerged from the shadows like they'd been waiting specifically for her. 3 men, though calling them men felt inadequate because something in their movement suggested predator rather than human. Something in the way they spread out to block both exits spoke of pack hunting tactics. And when the closest one inhaled deeply and smiled with too many teeth, Wren's body responded with adrenaline that felt electric, transformative. "She's been with them," the man said, and his voice carried harmonics that hurt her ears, frequencies that shouldn't exist in human speech. "The whelps, she reeks of them. Gregor wants them found, and look at this, she's going to lead us right to them." Wren didn't waste breath on questions or pleas. She'd learned at 14 that words rarely stopped violence, that the only responses that mattered were the physical ones. She swung her bag at the nearest attacker's face, felt the satisfying crunch of impact, and ran for the gap between the other two, knowing she wouldn't make it, but unable to surrender without trying. She was fast, faster than she should have been, faster than she'd ever moved in her life, but they were faster, and hands grabbed her jacket, yanked her backward, and she twisted, drove her elbow into someone's throat, heard choking, and felt savage satisfaction that tasted like copper and fury. They smelled wrong, these men, their scent carrying something wild and threatening that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to instinct she didn't know she possessed. Her hands burned with heat that seemed to come from inside her bones, and when she clawed at the face of the man holding her, her fingernails left wounds deeper than they should have, drew blood that looked black in the alley's darkness. But there were 3 of them, and 1 of her, and she was losing, being forced to the ground, and one of them was pulling out a phone, saying something about bringing her in. And Wren's vision was narrowing to a tunnel, her hearing fading beneath the rush of her own pulse, when the temperature dropped so suddenly that her breath became visible, when the air pressure changed like a storm front moving in, when the smell of pine and winter and something vast and dangerous flooded the alley and made every hair on her body stand at attention. The men froze, their heads snapping toward the alley's entrance, and the fear that transformed their faces was so profound, so absolute, that Wren felt her own terror spike in response, some primitive understanding that if these predators were frightened, whatever approached was exponentially more dangerous. He stepped from the shadows, and Wren's first thought was that calling him a man was technically accurate, but fundamentally insufficient, like calling a hurricane weather or calling the ocean water. True, but failing to capture the essential enormity. He stood at least 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block the streetlight behind him, and he moved with a grace that seemed impossible for someone his size. Each step deliberate and weighted with purpose that made the concrete seem inadequate beneath his feet. His hair was black, pulled back from a face that was all sharp angles and harder edges, and his eyes were molten amber, glowing with their own light source, fixed on Wren with an intensity that felt physical, that pressed against her chest and made breathing an active challenge rather than an autonomic function. The 3 men released her immediately and backed away, their postures shifting into something submissive, and one of them was making a high whining sound that definitely didn't come from a human throat. Alpha King, the one who'd grabbed Wren, stammered, and even in her disoriented state, Wren registered the title, the reverence and terror it carried. Gregor sent us to leave, the massive man said. And his voice was wrong, layered somehow, as if 2 voices spoke simultaneously, one human and one decidedly not. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight that made Wren's bones ache, that resonated in her chest like a physical blow. The 3 men fled, faster than should have been possible, disappearing into darkness with a speed that defied physics. And then Wren was alone with this stranger, this Alpha King, and every instinct she possessed was screaming contradictory instructions: run, submit, fight, surrender, until she couldn't move at all, frozen by competing imperatives. He took a step toward her, and the world condensed to the space between them, to the way his eyes tracked over her face like he was memorizing or recognizing, to the heat radiating from his body that she could feel from 6 feet away. And then their eyes met properly, fully, and something inside Wren's chest tore open. It felt like lightning channeled directly into her sternum, like every nerve ending in her body igniting simultaneously, like a hook buried behind her ribs attached to a golden rope that stretched across the space separating them and anchored somewhere inside his chest. The pain was exquisite and terrible, and beneath it, a rightness that terrified her more than the agony, a recognition that bypassed conscious thought and spoke in absolutes. Mine, yours, ours, inevitable. She could see it, actually see it with her physical eyes, the golden thread connecting them, pulsing with light that seemed to exist outside normal visual spectrum. And somewhere deep inside her, in a place she'd never consciously accessed, something that had been sleeping for her entire remembered life suddenly screamed awake. Mine, it said, the voice resonating through her bones, speaking with absolute authority. Mate, pack, home. The stranger made a sound that started as a growl and escalated into something that shattered the alley's remaining intact windows, that sent rats fleeing from dumpsters and made car alarms 3 blocks away start shrieking in sympathy. His eyes blazed brighter, no longer just amber, but shot through with veins of light, and his hands curled into claws, actual claws, his fingernails extending into curved talons that looked capable of tearing through steel. He was changing, losing the veneer of humanity. Coat being shrugged off, and the part of him beneath was massive and furred and wrong, and Wren scrambled backward, her rational mind reasserting itself through the chaos of instinct and impossible recognition, her survival drive overriding the golden thread's insistence that this creature represented safety rather than threat. "Stay away from me," she managed, her voice breaking on the words. And she tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't cooperate, adrenaline and shock rendering her coordination temporarily useless. He stopped advancing, but didn't retreat, his chest heaving with breaths that sounded more animal than human, and she watched him fight for control, watched humanity slowly reassert itself over whatever else lived inside his skin. When he spoke again, his voice was strained, each word clearly costing him effort. "Mine," he said first, the word emerging with possessive finality that allowed no argument. Then, with visible concentration, "You're coming with me. Now. You're not safe here." "No," Wren said, because agreeing felt like surrendering something essential, and because 5 children were alone in her apartment, waiting for her return, depending on her protection. "I don't know you. I don't know what you are. Stay away." She tried to run, instinct overriding logic, and made it perhaps 3 steps before he was in front of her, moving faster than her eyes could track, and the golden thread between them pulled taut, painful, and she gasped at the sensation of distance being enforced against the bond's preference. "Those men were hunters," he said, and his eyes were doing something hypnotic, holding her gaze with magnetic intensity. "They work for someone who wants something you have, someone dangerous. And you," his gaze dropped to her collarbone, to where her scar lay hidden beneath her shirt, and something in his expression shifted, sharpened. "You're not human. You don't know what you are, do you?" Before Wren could answer, before she could process the impossible statement, her phone buzzed in her pocket, the vibration absurdly normal against the surreal horror of the moment. She pulled it out with shaking hands, saw a message from an unknown number, and the words on the screen turned her blood to ice. "We have the children. Come to the old mill on Riverside. Come alone. You have 1 hour, or we start with the smallest one." What the blood remembers. The phone trembled in Wren's hands, the screen's glow illuminating her face in the alley's darkness, and she read the message 3 times, as if repetition might change the words, might transform threat into something survivable. Pip's face materialized in her mind, 7 years old, small for his age, the one who still cried silently in his sleep and reached for her hand whenever loud noises startled him, and the image of him frightened, hurt, alone, carved something hollow in her chest that filled immediately with a fury she'd never experienced before, white-hot and clarifying. "I have to go," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, and she moved to step around the massive stranger who'd called himself Alpha King, who'd spoken impossible things about her humanity and danger and bonds she didn't understand. "They have children, 5 children who are my responsibility, and I will not leave them." His hand caught her arm, gentle despite the strength she could feel coiled in his fingers, despite the claws that had retracted but left no doubt they could emerge again. What children? The question should have been simple, but the intensity in his amber eyes suggested nothing about this conversation would be simple. And Wren found herself explaining in rushed fragments. The warehouse, 3 weeks ago, 5 orphans who wouldn't speak about their past, who'd been living in her apartment, surviving on stolen food, and the fragile safety she could provide. She watched his expression shift as she described them, watched something that looked like shock, followed by cold, crystalline fury, settle over his features. "Describe them," he said, the command in his voice making her spine straighten reflexively. Their ages, appearances, everything. She did, rattling off details while precious minutes ticked away. Finn, 11, brown hair, green eyes. Jory, 9, black curls, dark eyes that flashed yellow sometimes in darkness. Beck, with his scarred face, Tansy with her red hair, Pip with his fragile smallness. The stranger's jaw clenched tighter with each description, and when she finished, he was utterly still in the way that predators went still before striking. "Those children are werewolves," he said, and the word hung in the air between them, absurd and impossible and somehow correct, explaining everything she'd been trying not to see. Juveniles who should have been eliminated 3 years ago. Their parents were part of a conspiracy to assassinate me. They were traitors and pack law demands. "They're children," Wren interrupted, her voice rising despite the danger radiating from him, despite the logical part of her mind screaming that arguing with someone who could tear her apart was survival suicide. Whatever their parents did, they're just children, and right now, they're hostages, and I'm wasting time while you tell me fairy tales about werewolves. "You can smell my wolf," he said, quietly, stepping closer, and she could smell him, pine and winter, and something wild that made her mouth water and her pulse race. "I can see yours in your eyes right now. The gray is bleeding to gold at the edges. You've always known you were different, the strength you shouldn't have, the rage you keep buried, the dreams of running on 4 legs through forests you've never visited." The words hit like physical blows because they were true, because she did dream of running and hunting and belonging to something vast and ancient, because she had broken a man's arm when she was 16 during a foster home incident, had watched it bend backward with a strength that shouldn't have existed in her thin frame. And the ease with which violence had come to her had frightened her more than the man's attack. "No," she said, but it was weak, denial crumbling under the weight of accumulated evidence, under the memory of the golden thread she could still see connecting her chest to his, pulsing with light that insisted on truth over comfort. He moved closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, and he took her hand with surprising gentleness, pressed it against his chest. His heartbeat was slow, too slow, impossibly slow for something alive, powerful enough that she could feel it reverberating up her arm. Then he guided her hand to her own chest, pressed her palm over her own heart, and the rhythm matched his exactly. Too slow, too powerful, too other. "Your wolf is suppressed," he said, his voice dropping to something almost gentle, though the intensity never wavered. "Buried under trauma or magic. But she's there. She's screaming at you right now that I'm your mate, that the bond between us is sacred and permanent, that fighting it will only cause pain." Mate. The word resonated through her bones, and the thing inside her that had woken in the alley pressed against her consciousness like a caged animal, demanding release, demanding acknowledgement, demanding she stop denying what every cell in her body recognized as absolute truth. "I don't have time for this," Wren said, pulling her hand back, shoving down the part of her that wanted to lean into him, to accept comfort from this dangerous stranger who smelled like home despite being completely unknown. "The children have 45 minutes before." "It's a trap," he interrupted. "Someone is using them as leverage to draw you out specifically. The question is why? Why would anyone want you badly enough to grab 5 wolf pups and gamble that you care enough to come?" He was already pulling out his phone, sending rapid messages. My head of security will meet us at the mill with a tactical team. If this is Gregor Ironhide behind this, and given his hunters just tried to grab you, I'd say certainty is high, then it's a move against me. Political, a coup attempt using you as the catalyst. Who is Gregor? Why would he want me? I'm nobody. I'm just... You're not nobody, the stranger said, and the certainty in his voice made her want to believe him. Not to me. And that scar on your collarbone? His finger traced the air above where the mark lay hidden beneath her shirt, not touching but close enough that she felt heat. That's a pack mark. You belonged to someone before your memory was taken, before someone tried to erase what you are. The vehicle he led her to was a black SUV that looked military-grade, all reinforced panels and tinted windows, and he drove with the kind of speed that suggested traffic laws were optional recommendations rather than rules. The dashboard clock glowed 2:47 a.m., each minute a countdown toward catastrophe, and Wren's hands clenched in her lap, fingernails digging crescents into her palms. "My name is Corvus," he said, as they navigated empty streets, his eyes flicking between road and mirrors with practiced vigilance. "Corvus Nightborn, Alpha King of the Northern Territories. I rule 7 packs, and I've been hunting evidence of Gregor Ironhide's treason for 6 years. He's my high beta, second in command, trusted advisor, and I believe he's been systematically murdering pack members and stealing their territories for decades." He explained pack hierarchy while driving: alphas who led, betas who enforce, omegas who maintained social bonds, the complex political structures that governed werewolf society beneath humanity's oblivious notice. He explained mate bonds, the sacred connection between souls that transcended choice or logic, that happened perhaps once in a lifetime if a wolf was fortunate, that couldn't be broken without destroying both parties. "It's why I lost control in the alley," he said, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. The bond snapping into place. For me, it was like every protective instinct I possess amplified 1,000 times. You're mine to protect now, whether you accept it or not, and my wolf doesn't care about your consent or comfort. It only cares about keeping you safe, keeping you close, and eliminating threats. "I didn't ask for this," Wren said, and the words came out more desperate than angry. "I didn't ask to be whatever you think I am. I just want the children safe." "I know," Corvus said, and something in his voice softened marginally. "But what we want and what we are don't always align. Those children, if they're who I think they are, they're the offspring of the wolves Gregor accused of treason. Their parents were Silvercrest Pack, loyal to an alpha that Gregor supposedly defeated in fair challenge 15 years ago. But I've never been convinced it was fair. Too convenient, too clean." Silvercrest. The name hit something deep in Wren's mind, sent ripples through memory that scattered before she could grasp them, left only the ghost of recognition and a grief so profound it threatened to overwhelm her. The mill loomed ahead, abandoned industrial decay against the night sky, windows like dead eyes reflecting nothing. Corvus stopped the vehicle 2 blocks away, killed the engine, and turned to face her with expression grave. "Whatever happens in there, you stay behind me. The mate bond is new for you, but for me, it's agony. Every instinct I have is screaming at me to take you somewhere safe and guard you until this threat is eliminated. Fighting that instinct while trying to maintain tactical awareness may be the hardest thing I've ever done. So please, don't make it harder by taking unnecessary risks." They approached on foot, Corvus moving with predatory silence, and Wren trying to match his careful placement of steps. 3 other figures emerged from shadows, his security team, all moving with the same uncanny grace, all regarding Wren with expressions that ranged from curious to concerned. A woman with short silver hair approached Corvus, spoke in low tones about perimeter and positioning, and her eyes kept flicking to Wren with something that looked like pity. The mill's entrance yawned open, darkness absolute beyond the threshold, and every survival instinct Wren possessed screamed at her to run. But the image of 5 frightened children pushed her forward, through the doorway, into shadows that smelled like rust and decay, and something else, something wrong that made her newly awakened wolf snarl inside her chest. The main floor was empty, machinery long since stripped away, leaving only concrete and ghosts of industry. Their footsteps echoed too loud, announcing their presence, and Corvus's body language shifted into something aggressive, protective, positioning himself slightly in front of Wren. Then she heard them, small voices, crying, coming from below. A basement. Pip's voice, unmistakable, calling her name with desperate hope. And Wren's control shattered. She pushed past Corvus, ran for the sound, found stairs descending into deeper darkness, and she was halfway down before his hand caught her arm, yanked her back with strength that should have hurt, but was carefully controlled. "Wait," he hissed. But then they both froze, because a voice was speaking, amplified somehow, filling the mill with words that dripped satisfaction and malice. "Welcome, Alpha King," the voice said, male and cultured and utterly cold. "And welcome, little Wren. Or should I use your real name? Should I call you Renly Silvercrest, daughter of Marcus and Thea, the alpha I killed to take his position 15 years ago? The heir I should have eliminated, but kept alive because dead martyrs are dangerous, and forgotten children are so much safer. Did you really think I wouldn't know you the moment you surfaced? The moment you started collecting Silvercrest's orphaned guards children, like you were rebuilding the pack I destroyed?" The words crashed through Wren's consciousness, each one a detonation, and memories that had them locked away began cracking their cages, bleeding through in fragments. A woman's laugh, silver hair braided with flowers, strong arms lifting her high, a man's voice calling her his little wolf cub. Fire and screaming, and something cold locked around her neck that made her forget, made her small, made her nothing. "My name is Wren Holloway," she said, but the words felt like lies in her mouth now. "Your name," the voice corrected, "is Renly Silvercrest. And those children in my basement are the last loose ends of my carefully constructed empire. Kill them, and my secret dies. Kill you, and any claim to Silvercrest territory dies. Such simple solutions, such necessary housekeeping." Corvus was already moving, barking orders to his team, and they descended the stairs in tactical formation. But Wren could already tell what they'd find before they reached the bottom, could feel the wrongness. And when they burst into the basement, it was empty, except for a speaker playing a loop of children's cries, recorded and weaponized. "It was all bait," Corvus said through clenched teeth. "He wanted us away from the fortress. He wanted—" His phone rang, and when he answered, Wren watched his face go white. When? How many? He hung up, looked at her with expression that mixed fury and guilt and determination. "Gregor's forces are attacking my fortress. 60 wolves under my protection, including elders and juveniles. He's using your children and you as distraction while he makes his real move." His eyes blazed gold. "I have to go back, but I can't leave you unprotected, can't leave the children unguarded wherever they really are." Wren's mind raced, and then she understood with crystalline clarity. He has them at my apartment. He never moved them far because he didn't need to. The text wasn't a summons to him. It was a way to get me away so he could grab them without resistance. Corvus nodded grimly. "Then we split up. My team goes to the fortress. You and I go to your apartment. That's what he wants," Wren said, "to divide your forces." "I know," Corvus said, "but mate bond or not, I'm not letting you face this alone. And those children, whether their parents were traitors or not, They don't deserve to pay for adult mistakes. They ran. Adaptation forçada. They found the children exactly where Wren had predicted, huddled in her basement apartment, surrounded by 3 of Gregor's wolves who'd broken the door off its hinges and positioned themselves between the juveniles and any possible escape. The confrontation lasted perhaps 90 seconds. Corvus moved with a speed and violence that bypassed Wren's ability to track individual movements, and by the time her brain caught up to her eyes, 3 adult wolves lay unconscious on her floor, and 5 terrified children were pressed against the far wall, staring at the Alpha King with the kind of primal fear that recognized a predator so far above them in hierarchy that resistance wasn't even conceivable. Finn positioned himself in front of the smaller 4, despite his trembling, despite the way his eyes kept flashing between green and amber as his wolf struggled for dominance under stress, and when he spoke, his voice cracked with terror and desperate courage. "Are you going to kill us?" Corvus stood among the unconscious wolves, blood on his hands and his eyes still blazing gold with barely contained violence. And Wren watched him fight for control, watched humanity reassert itself over the wolf that wanted to eliminate threats permanently. When he spoke, his voice was rough but deliberate. "No, you're under my protection now, all of you." His gaze shifted to Wren. "All of you are under my protection, and anyone who touches you answers to me." The drive to Corvus's compound took 40 minutes through mountain roads that climbed into elevations where the air thinned and pine forests pressed close on either side. Dawn was breaking when they arrived, pink light illuminating a structure that defied Wren's expectations. Not some rustic cabin or cave system, but a fortress that blended ancient stone foundations with modern steel and glass, built into the mountainside like it had grown there, like the rock itself had been convinced to take this shape. Guards watched from positions that suggested military training, and as the SUV passed through gates that looked capable of withstanding siege warfare, Wren felt the weight of entering territory that operated under rules she didn't know, under laws she'd never learned, under the authority of the man sitting beside her who was simultaneously stranger and mate and alpha king of territories she hadn't known existed yesterday. The children pressed close to her as they were led through corridors where wolves in human form stopped to stare, where the scent of pack, dozens of individual signatures blending into something collective, made Wren's newly awakened wolf want to either submit or flee. Corvus led them to a wing of the fortress that he explained was private quarters, rooms connected by interior doors, furnished with the kind of luxury that felt obscene compared to Wren's basement apartment. "You can stay here," Corvus said, gesturing to a suite with windows overlooking forest and mountain. "The children's rooms connect through there. Guards will be posted for protection, not imprisonment. You're free to move through the fortress, but until we understand the full scope of Gregor's plans, I'd prefer you stay within defended areas." Wren wanted to argue, wanted to insist on independence and agency and all the things that staying here would compromise. But 5 exhausted children were already exploring the rooms with wide eyes, and Pip had discovered a bed so large he could spread out completely without touching edges. And the practical reality was that her basement apartment, with its broken door and blood-stained floor, was no longer safe, had perhaps never been safe. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate. Adequate, but genuine. Corvus nodded, and something in his expression suggested he wanted to say more, wanted to stay, but discipline won over desire, and he left, though she noticed he positioned himself in the hallway just outside, close enough that she could smell pine and winter through the door's gap. The children finally broke down once they were alone, 3 weeks of fear and trauma releasing in sobs that Jory tried to suppress and Pip didn't bother hiding. They clustered around Wren on the massive bed, 5 bodies seeking comfort and assurance, and she held them while they cried, while they confessed fragments of their history. "Our parents weren't traitors," Beck said, his scarred face pressed against Wren's shoulder. "They were trying to stop Gregor. They found proof he was killing pack members to steal their lands, proof he'd murdered the old Silvercrest Alpha and his mate, your parents. They were going to present evidence to the council, but Gregor found out. He killed them and called them traitors so no one would believe anything they'd said." Finn wiped his eyes, trying to maintain the composure he'd assigned himself as their protector. Before they died, they hid a journal. It lists everyone Gregor killed, every territory he stole, every law he broke. It has testimonies and recordings. They told us where it was hidden, made us memorize how to access it, but we were just kids. We didn't know what to do, so we ran and hid in the human city where we thought he couldn't find us. Tansy, quiet Tansy, who noticed everything, added softly, "Until you found us. And then we thought maybe we were supposed to find you, that maybe you were meant to be our alpha, like our parents said you would be someday." The words settled over Wren with the weight of destiny and responsibility she'd never asked for but couldn't refuse, and she thought about the scar on her collarbone, about memories locked behind walls that were beginning to crack, about a life stolen from her that was demanding to be reclaimed. Over the following days, a routine established itself through necessity and Corvus's patient insistence. Wren learned to navigate the fortress's corridors, learned the names of pack members who regarded her with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism to something that looked like hope. A wolf named Marlowe, Corvus's head of security with silver hair and athlete's build, began teaching her about pack hierarchy and werewolf society, explaining customs and laws with professional efficiency. In the training room one afternoon, Marlowe shifted partially, a demonstration of control that left her with claws and fangs and eyes glowing amber while maintaining human form. And Wren's body responded without permission, heat flooding through her veins, her hands burning with the sensation of something trying to emerge from beneath her skin. "Your wolf wants out," Marlowe observed, circling Wren with predatory assessment. "The suppression is breaking. Whatever magic kept her caged is failing, probably because of the mate bond. Corvus's wolf is calling to yours, and she's desperate to answer." That evening, at Corvus's insistence, they gathered for a formal dinner in a hall that could have accommodated 100, but held perhaps 30, pack members who lived in the fortress, who served in his administration or guard. Wren sat at his right, in what Marlowe had explained was the mate's position, a placement that declared intention and status to everyone watching. And 5 children sat nearby, eating with the cautious enthusiasm of those unaccustomed to reliable meals. Pack members stared, their attention focused on Wren with intensity that made her want to hide. And when a younger wolf, perhaps 19, with the kind of beauty that knew its power, let his gaze linger too long on Wren's face, Corvus's growl shook the chandelier overhead, rattled glasses on the table, made every wolf present drop their eyes in immediate submission. "Stop scaring them," Wren said before thinking. "Pack," before remembering that contradicting an alpha in front of his pack probably violated a dozen protocols. But Corvus blinked at her, surprised, and then, impossibly, his posture relaxed marginally, aggression dialing back to mere vigilance. "Sorry," he said, the word rough but genuine, and around the table, pack members exchanged glances that suggested they'd just witnessed something unprecedented. Later, past midnight when the fortress had quieted and the children were asleep in their connected rooms, Wren found herself unable to rest, her mind too full of impossible information and her body humming with energy that felt electric beneath her skin. She wandered corridors until she found herself on a balcony overlooking forests that stretched to horizons, moonlight painting everything silver and shadow. Corvus was already there, standing at the railing with his back to her, and she knew he'd heard her approach, but he didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her presence until she stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice quieter than she'd heard it, lacking the command that usually weighted his words. "Too much has changed," Wren said. 3 days ago, I was nobody, struggling to pay rent and feed 5 strays. Now I'm supposedly the heir to a murdered alpha, maid to a king, and there are people who want me dead for reasons I don't fully understand. Gregor kept you alive but suppressed because a dead Silvercrest heir becomes a martyr," Corvus said, his hands tightening on the railing. A forgotten one, lost in human ignorance, becomes nothing. He killed your parents, stole their territories, and trapped you in a life where you'd never threaten his power. It was crueler than murder and more effective. Tell me about them, Ren said. My parents, if you knew them. Corvus smiled, the expression transforming his face from intimidating to something almost gentle. Your father, Marcus, was brilliant, a strategist who believed pack society needed to evolve, who pushed for rights for omegas and alliances with human governments. Your mother, Thea, was his balance, fierce and protective, but with a kindness that made people loyal unto death. They would have been extraordinary leaders, and they loved you completely. I was young when they died, barely into my position as Alpha King, but I remember the way your father talked about you, his little wolf cub who was going to change the world. Ren felt tears tracking down her face, grief for people she couldn't remember, but who'd loved her, who died protecting what she represented. Corvus reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't, he tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear, his touch gentle despite the strength in his hands. I will help you remember who you were, he said, voice low and fervent. And whoever you choose to become now, with or without me, with or without the pack, I will keep you safe. That's not the mate bond talking. That's a promise from me to you. The bond between them pulsed golden and warm, and Ren felt its pull, felt the rightness of his proximity, that also felt the genuine care beneath his words, the offer of protection without demand for submission, and something in her chest that had been tight since childhood loosened marginally. The next day, an ancient wolf named Idris requested audience, leading them to a library filled with leather-bound volumes and the smell of old paper and preservation magic. He was perhaps 120 years old, but appeared only 50, with gray-streaked hair and eyes that held too much knowledge, and he spread genealogy records across a massive oak table with reverent care. Silvercrest was one of the 7 founding packs, Idris explained, his finger tracing bloodlines that stretched back centuries. Your lineage is ancient and powerful. Your father was next in line to challenge for Alpha King before his death. Gregor couldn't allow it. Marcus had support, had vision, had everything. Anything necessary to win, so Gregor eliminated him and framed it as righteous challenge. He looked at the 5 children who'd clustered near Ren. And your parents were Silvercrest's most loyal guards. When they discovered Gregor's crimes, they died protecting the evidence. Before they fell, they hid it somewhere only their children could access. Finn stepped forward, green eyes meeting Idris's without flinching despite the age and power differential. We'll tell you where it is. We'll help you bring Gregor down, but we want something first. He turned to Corvus, desperation and courage warring in his young face. Make Ren our alpha, our real alpha. Make Silvercrest Pack legitimate again, the way it should have been. The Teeth of Buried Truths, the awakening ritual, Corvus explained with a gravity that made Ren's stomach clench, was the only way to make her a recognized alpha under pack law, the only way to legally claim the children under her protection and rebuild Silvercrest as a legitimate pack rather than a ghost of murdered history. But the ritual came with costs that he detailed with clinical precision, while his eyes betrayed the horror of what he was asking her to endure. 3 days of preparation involving fasting and ritual marking, teas brewed by pack healers that would burn through her system and weaken the magical suppression on her wolf, and finally the breaking itself, where the metaphysical collar that had caged her wolf for 15 years would be torn away, allowing her true nature to emerge or killing her in the attempt. Some don't survive, Corvus said, and his voice was steady, but his hands were clenched so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. The shock of awakening after so many years of suppression, especially suppression this deep, this deliberate, can be too much for the human body to withstand. And I can't... He stopped, jaw working, and when he continued, the words came rough with suppressed emotion. I can't do this to you. I can't ask you to risk death when we've only just found each other. Ren looked at 5 faces watching her with desperate hope, at children who'd lost everything and were asking her to be what they needed, to step into a role stolen from her before she'd had chance to understand what it meant. She thought about her parents, murdered for trying to stop corruption, about 15 years stolen from her, about identity and purpose and the peculiar clarity that came from finally understanding why she'd always felt incomplete. "Tell me what I have to do," she said. The 3 days that followed existed in a haze of discomfort that gradually escalated to agony. The healers, ancient wolves who spoke in languages Ren didn't recognize and worked with herbs that smelled like earth and thyme, painted symbols on her skin with ink that burned, fed her teas that tasted like copper and made her feverish, delirious, sent her cycling through hot and cold until she couldn't remember what normal temperature felt like. Corvus remained nearby, constantly, his presence an anchor, even as the mate bond amplified her suffering, sent it echoing through him until Marlowe finally insisted he needed to maintain some distance or risk going feral from secondhand pain. But he refused, sitting vigil outside her room through nights when Ren's screams woke the entire wing, his own control fracturing every time she cried out, and more than once Marlowe had to physically restrain him from bursting through the door and ending the ritual prematurely. During the fever dreams, memories returned in violent fragments that felt like shards of glass being extracted from her brain. Her mother braiding her hair and singing in a language Ren understood instinctively now, ancient pack songs about moon and hunt and belonging. Her father teaching her to track by scent, laughing when she'd caught the trail faster than he'd expected. The night everything ended, flames consuming their home while her mother shoved her into a cellar, pressing desperate kisses to her face and whispering, "Hide, my little wolf, hide and live, and come back to us when you're strong enough." And Gregor's face above her in the darkness, cold satisfaction in his eyes as he locked a silver collar around her neck and spoke words that made everything inside her compress and diminish and forget. On the second day, news reached the fortress that Gregor had called a formal challenge council, invoking ancient pack law to demand Corvus answer for harboring traitor blood, for protecting the children of convicted conspirators. He was arriving in 2 days with allied packs, and the political pressure was mounting. Alphas who'd remained neutral were being forced to choose sides, and some who'd previously supported Corvus were wavering, uncertain whether protecting 5 juveniles was worth potential civil war. Marlowe brought the intelligence during one of Ren's brief lucid periods, standing at attention while reporting that Gregor's forces numbered at least 80 wolves, that the council would have legal authority to strip Corvus of his position if he couldn't justify his actions, that the entire situation was deteriorating faster than they'd anticipated. "We're running out of time," Marlowe said, her silver hair catching lamplight as she paced. "If Ren doesn't complete the awakening before Gregor arrives, if she can't stand before the council as legitimate Silvercrest Alpha, then those children have no legal protection. Pack law is clear. Offspring of convicted traitors can be claimed by any alpha, and Gregor will demand custody specifically to eliminate them." The third night, when the moon reached its apex and the fortress gathered in the ancient stone circle deep in the mountain's heart, Ren was led out wearing ceremonial white cloth that felt too thin against the cold, her body weak from fasting and fever, her mind still fractured from returned memories. The circle was surrounded by pack members holding torches, their faces solemn, and in the center, an altar of stone worn smooth by centuries of ritual use. Corvus stood waiting, dressed in formal regalia that marked him unmistakably as Alpha King, black leather and silver threading, ceremonial knives at his belt, and an expression that looked like he was preparing for battle rather than ceremony. When Ren approached, he caught her arm to steady her, and she felt his hand trembling against her skin. "Last chance to refuse," he said quietly, for her ears only. "We'll find another way. I'll find another way." "Do it," Ren said, because backing down now would waste the agony she'd already endured, would abandon the children to fates she couldn't protect them from, would leave her forever wondering who she might have been if fear hadn't stopped her. The ritual words were in the old language, syllables that resonated through the stone and made the torchlight flicker. And Corvus spoke them with the kind of authority that came from centuries of tradition and power that didn't require violence to prove itself. He moved around her in prescribed patterns, anointing her with oils that smelled like pine and earth, marking her with ash from the pack's founding fires. And with each component of ceremony, Ren felt something inside her responding, reaching toward freedom. The breaking came without warning. One moment Corvus was chanting, the next his hand was on her collarbone where the scar lay, and power surged through his palm like lightning, like targeted destruction. And the metaphysical collar that had caged her wolf for 15 years shattered. Ren screamed, the sound tearing from her throat with force that made her taste blood. And the pain was everything. Bones trying to shift under skin that resisted, power flooding channels that had been blocked so long they'd nearly atrophied. Her wolf surging toward freedom with desperate fury that didn't care what it had to destroy to emerge. She felt her spine arching impossibly, felt her hands curling into shapes they'd never held, felt her teeth sharpening, and her senses exploding outward until she could smell every individual in the circle, could hear heartbeats and breathing and the whisper of fabric against skin. Her eyes blazed gold. She could see the light reflecting in Corvus's face. And then her body was shifting, the first transformation, involuntary and excruciating and undeniable. Bones broke and reformed, muscles tore and rebuilt, skin gave way to fur the color of dark auburn, catching firelight, and she fell forward onto hands that became paws, her scream becoming a howl that echoed through the mountain and sent prey animals fleeing for miles in every direction. Her wolf was large for a female, ancient bloodline evident in her size and the power that radiated from her, even in confusion and disorientation. And she snarled at the crowd, at the strangers surrounding her, instinct demanding she fight or flee. But then Corvus shifted, massive black wolf that made her look small despite her own size, and approached with submissive posture that confused her, that spoke of deference despite his obvious dominance. And his scent was pine and winter and mine, and her wolf recognized him with certainty that bypassed all confusion. She circled him, testing, and he remained still, let her learn his scent and shape, and when she finally pressed against his side, the gathered pack gasped in unison because it was acceptance, because it was acknowledgement of the mate bond in its purest form, and it couldn't be faked or forced. The shift back to human form was somehow worse than the first transformation, every change reversing with equal agony. And Ren collapsed into Corvus's arms as he shifted back simultaneously, catching her before she hit stone. Her first words, gasped against his chest, were, "I remember, all of it, everything he took." The children rushed forward despite protocol, despite the solemnity of the moment, and she held them while they cried with relief, while Finn said, "You're really our alpha now, really and legally." And the weight of that responsibility settled over her like a mantle she'd been meant to wear her entire life. But there was no time for celebration or recovery, because Finn was already speaking with urgency that cut through exhaustion, explaining what they'd come to reveal. The journal our parents hid, it's in the old Silvercrest estate, in the Alpha's vault. We know the way because our mother helped hide it there before she died. But the vault has protections. It needs Silvercrest blood to open, and it needs the retinal scan of one of the guards who sealed it. Beck's voice was quiet, haunted, when he added the horrifying detail. Gregor kept our mother's eyes after he killed her. We saw them in his study once, when he thought we weren't looking, in a preservation jar. He kept them like trophies. The words hung in the air, their grotesque implications rendering everyone momentarily silent. And then Marlo was speaking, her voice urgent. The Silvercrest estate is on the border of Gregor's claimed territory. Getting in and out undetected would require... She stopped, her phone buzzing, And when she looked at the screen, her face went absolutely white. "I need to speak with you privately, Alpha. Now." Corvus's eyes narrowed, but he stood, motioning for Marlowe to follow him to the circle's edge, and Wren watched their conversation with growing dread, watched Marlowe's posture shift from professional to desperate, watched Corvus's expression transform from confusion to betrayal so profound it was physically painful to witness. When he returned, his voice was cold enough to make the torches gutter. "How long, Marlowe? How long have you been reporting to Gregor?" Marlowe dropped to her knees, submission absolute, tears streaming down her face. 3 months. He has my brother. Captured him during a border dispute and said he'd return him unharmed if I fed him intelligence. I never thought he'd use it like this. I thought I was just reporting troop movements, security schedules, nothing that would actually hurt anyone. The circle erupted in snarls and accusations, pack members demanding her execution for treason, and Corvus's control looked gossamer thin, his wolf visibly fighting for dominance, demanding blood for betrayal. But Wren stepped forward, placing herself between Corvus and Marlowe, her newly awakened alpha authority making pack members pause despite their fury. "When is he coming?" Wren asked Marlowe directly. "Tell me everything." "Tonight," Marlowe sobbed. "He knows about the awakening, knows you're vulnerable immediately after. He's bringing 50 wolves. He'll be here within the hour. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." The fortress alarms began shrieking before she finished speaking, and through the stone circle's opening, they could see lights in the valley below, dozens of vehicles approaching with headlights off, moving with coordination that spoke of military planning. And then Gregor's voice came over speakers, magically amplified to carry across the entire mountain, cultured and cold and absolutely certain of victory. "Alpha King Corvus, I invoke council law and demand you surrender the Silvercrest Pretender and the traitor whelps. Refuse, and I will consider it declaration of war against the combined packs I represent. You have 10 minutes to comply, or I burn that fortress with everyone inside. The choice, as always, is yours." The hollow hour, Corvus began issuing orders with the kind of cold tactical precision that came from centuries of leadership and wars Wren couldn't imagine, his voice cutting through the chaos as pack members scattered to defensive positions, as weapons were distributed and strategic points fortified. The fortress had been built to withstand siege, he explained while moving, but 60 wolves against Gregor's 50, plus whatever reinforcements he'd hidden in reserve, meant casualties were inevitable, meant children and elders sheltering in the interior rooms might still die if Gregor decided scorched earth was preferable to defeat. Wren watched him coordinate, watched him transform from mate to military commander, and she understood with crystalline clarity that he would sacrifice himself before surrendering her or the children, that his protective instinct and his honor would get him killed defending a bloodline he'd only just discovered and juveniles who weren't even his pack. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Her and 5 children weighed against 60 innocents who'd sworn loyalty to their alpha king and trusted him to keep them safe. She waited until Corvus was occupied with Marlowe and the security team, mapping defensive formations and discussing ammunition distribution, and then she moved with the kind of decisive speed that didn't allow second-guessing. The secret passage Idris had shown her during her recovery days, ancient tunnels built when Silvercrest and Nightborn had been allied packs, before Gregor's corruption had poisoned everything, lay behind a tapestry in the library. And she knew the children would follow, because they always followed, because in 3 weeks they'd learned to trust her completely. "We're leaving," she whispered when all 5 had gathered, their faces pale but determined. "Gregor wants us, so we remove ourselves from the equation. Corvus can negotiate or fight without worrying about protecting us, and we go get the evidence that ends this." "He'll kill you," Finn said, his 11-year-old face too serious, too aware of violence and consequence. "He'll kill all of us." Maybe, Wren agreed, because lying to them would dishonor their intelligence and courage. But staying here guarantees people die protecting us. At least this way, we're choosing our own risk. They moved through tunnels that smelled like earth and time, following Beck's directions because his parents had helped construct these passages, had made sure their son knew every hidden route in case escape became necessary. Behind them, Wren heard the first sounds of combat, roars and gunfire, and the particular coccular cacophony of wolves in battle, and she felt the mate bond stretch as distance increased, felt Corvus's confusion spike into fury as he discovered her absence, felt his wolf clawing for dominance because his mate was fleeing into danger, and every instinct demanded he follow, protect, claim. She pushed sensation down, ignored the bond's insistence that she return, that she stay close to her mate where she belonged, and kept moving through darkness illuminated only by Jory's phone flashlight, their breathing harsh and their footsteps echoing off stone walls. They emerged a mile from the fortress, in forest thick enough to provide cover, and began the journey toward the Silvercrest estate with the kind of desperate speed that ignored exhaustion and fear. Wren's body was still recovering from the awakening, her muscles trembling with fatigue, and her head pounding from sensory overload as her newly freed wolf struggled to process input she'd been denied for 15 years. Everything was too loud, too bright, scents overwhelming in their complexity, and she stumbled more than once before Finn caught her arm, steadied her with surprising strength for someone so young. They'd covered perhaps 3 miles when Wren smelled them, wolves, 8 distinct signatures, moving through the forest in coordination that spoke of trained hunters, Gregor's forces tracking them, and she realized with sick certainty that he'd anticipated this possibility, had positioned wolves specifically to intercept any escape attempt. "Run," she told the children, her voice low and urgent. "Keep going toward the estate. Don't stop. Don't look back." "We're not leaving you," Jory said, her fierce 9-year-old face set with determination that would have been admirable if it wasn't suicidal. "You're not leaving me," Wren corrected. "You're completing the mission. Get to the vault, get the evidence. That's an order from your alpha." The hunters emerged from the trees before further argument was possible. 8 adult wolves in human form, all larger than Wren, all moving with predatory confidence. They circled, cutting off escape routes, and the one who appeared to be leading smiled with too many teeth. "The pretender alpha and the traitor spawn," he said, his voice carrying the particular cruelty of those who enjoyed their work. "Gregor will reward us well for this delivery." Wren's wolf surged forward, demanding she shift, demanding she fight, but her control was too new, too fragile, and instead she felt power flood her limbs without transformation, felt strength that shouldn't exist in human form, as her newly awakened nature refused to be caged ever again. When the first hunter lunged, she met him with speed that surprised them both, her fist connecting with his jaw hard enough to snap his head back, to send him sprawling. The fight that followed existed in fragments of violence and desperation, Wren moving on instinct rather than training, her wolf guiding human muscles through combinations she'd never learned, claws extending partially from her fingernails to rake across faces and throats. She killed 2 outright, their blood hot on her hands, and the wrongness of ending life warring with the savage satisfaction of protecting her pack. And she wounded 3 more before superior numbers and experience began telling. Claws raked across her ribs, tearing through shirt and skin, and the pain was clarifying, sharpening her focus, even as blood soaked her clothing. Teeth sank into her shoulder, a wolf having shifted partially, and she screamed, drove her elbow back into vulnerable ribs, heard bone crack. But there were too many, and she was too new to this, and when the largest hunter grabbed her from behind, arms pinning hers, she couldn't break free despite thrashing with everything she had. The children fought too, 5 juvenile wolves who shifted with desperate necessity, untrained and small but fierce. And Ran watched Pip's tiny wolf form leap at a hunter's legs, watched Tansy use her speed to distract and evade, watched Finn coordinate them with tactical awareness that spoke of watching his parents, of learning through observation before he'd been old enough for formal training. But they were losing, being driven back, and Ren felt blood loss making her movements sluggish, felt consciousness trying to gray at the edges, and she thought with peculiar clarity that this was how she'd die, not in the comfort of old age, not peacefully, but fighting for children she'd known only weeks, for a heritage reclaimed too late, for a future she'd barely glimpsed. They reached the Silvercrest estate as dawn broke, 5 bleeding children and their wounded alpha stumbling through ruins that made Ren's newly returned memories scream in recognition and grief. The home where she'd spent her first 10 years stood in charred skeleton, walls collapsed and gardens gone to wilderness, and she could see it as it had been, beautiful and alive, full of pack and purpose, overlaid with what Gregor had made it, a monument to his cruelty, a warning to anyone who might challenge his authority. The vault entrance lay beneath the main house's foundation, hidden under rubble that the children helped clear with small hands and determined effort. The door itself was ancient metal covered in symbols that glowed faintly in response to Ren's proximity, recognizing Silvercrest blood, and when she pressed her palm to the seal, it burned with magic that made her gasp. The door opened partially, mechanisms grinded after 15 years of disuse, and a voice, feminine, her mother's voice preserved in spellwork, spoke from the metal itself. Identity confirmed, Silvercrest bloodline, secondary verification required, retinal scan of authorized guard. They didn't have the eyes, didn't have access to Gregor's study where he kept his grotesque trophies, and Ren felt despair settle over her like a physical weight. They'd come so far, survived so much, and they were going to fail because of biology and Gregor's sick collection habits. Finn stepped forward, his young face set with terrible determination. There's another way. The vault can accept a blood sacrifice from a guard's direct bloodline. My mother was the guard. I'm her son. I can open it. He was moving toward the altar built into the vault's entrance before Ren processed his intention, before she understood what he was offering. And she lunged, caught his arm, pulled him back with strength that made him yelp. "No," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "You're a child. I won't. I can't." "My parents died for this," Finn said, and tears were streaming down his face, but his voice was steady. "Beck's parents, Tansy's, Jory's, Pip's, they all died trying to stop Gregor. It has to mean something. We can't let him keep winning." The sound of slow, mocking applause echoed through the ruins, and Ren's head snapped up to see Gregor descending the estate's collapsed main staircase with 20 wolves at his back, all of them armed, all of them positioned to kill. He looked exactly as her returned memories painted him, middle-aged and powerful, gray-streaked hair and cold blue eyes, the kind of face that could simulate warmth while planning murder. "How touching," Gregor said, his cultured voice at odds with the violence his presence promised. "The lost princess and her little orphans. You've saved me considerable trouble coming here. I was prepared to extract you from Corvus's fortress, which would have been messy and expensive. This is so much more convenient." Ren pushed all 5 children behind her despite her wounds, despite the way her vision was blurring from blood loss, and her wolf snarled inside her chest, demanding she fight, demanding she protect her pack, even if it killed her. "You murdered my parents. You murdered their parents. You've stolen and killed for 15 years. It ends tonight." "Does it?" Gregor smiled, and it was the expression of someone who'd already won and was simply enjoying the performance. "You're barely awakened, wounded, protecting 5 juveniles against 20 trained wolves. The mathematics are not in your favor, little Renly. And as for evidence," he held up a leather journal, aged and obviously valuable. "Did you think I'd leave this lying around? I retrieved it years ago. Destroying it would have raised questions, but keeping it close, ensuring no one could access it, that was simple prudence. The children made sounds of dismay, their hope crumbling, and Wren felt her own certainty fracturing because they'd risked everything for evidence that didn't exist, because Gregor had always been 3 steps ahead. "Here's what happens now," Gregor continued, gesturing to his wolves who began advancing in coordinated formation. "I kill you and the children quickly, I'm not unnecessarily cruel to juveniles, and I return to the fortress with your bodies and proof that you attacked me first, that I was simply defending myself. Corvus will have no choice but to accept my story or declare war on the 6 packs I've allied. Either way, I win." His wolves attacked, and Wren fought with desperate fury, felt her wolf pushing for full transformation despite her exhaustion, and she was dimly aware of the children fighting beside her, of Gregor shifting into a massive gray wolf with silver scars, of teeth and claws and blood that might have been hers or theirs or the enemy's. Pain exploded through her ribs as Gregor's jaws closed, as he bore her to the ground with weight and strength she couldn't match, and she saw his eyes, cold and satisfied, as he prepared for the killing blow. Through the haze of pain and approaching darkness, Wren felt the mate bond suddenly flare incandescent, felt Corvus's presence through it like a beacon, and his fury wasn't just rage, but something transcendent, something that had moved beyond sanity into pure protective violence. She felt the moment his humanity fractured completely, felt his wolf take absolute control, felt him go feral with the knowledge that his mate was dying. The howl that echoed through the forest was apocalyptic, was the sound of restraint and civilization being abandoned, and it made birds explode from trees for miles, made prey animals flee in mindless panic, made even Gregor pause with his teeth at Wren's throat. And then Corvus was coming, and he wasn't alone. When the king breaks his chains, the forest filled with wolves, over 100 strong, emerging from the trees like a tide of fur and fury and absolute loyalty. And at their head ran Corvus in his massive black wolf form, easily twice the size of any other wolf present. But it was his eyes that sent terror through Gregor's forces. Completely black, no amber visible, the sign of an alpha who'd gone gutturally feral, who'd lost the human rationality that provided mercy and restraint. Feral alphas were catastrophes contained in flesh, unable to distinguish ally from enemy, driven only by base instinct to protect and destroy. And the fact that Corvus had maintained enough control to bring his army, rather than simply charging alone, spoke to willpower that shouldn't exist. Gregor's wolves scattered immediately, instinct overriding training, because you didn't fight feral alphas, you fled and prayed they didn't consider you significant enough to chase. But Gregor himself held position, his jaws still at Wren's throat, using her as shield and hostage, and his eyes tracked Corvus's approach with calculation that suggested he believed negotiation was still possible, that even feral wolves could be reasoned with through the right leverage. He was catastrophically wrong. Corvus hit him like an avalanche, the impact sending both wolves tumbling away from Wren in a blur of black and gray fur, and the sound that emerged from Corvus's throat was nothing remotely human, was pure animal rage given voice. Gregor was skilled, had centuries of combat experience, but feral strength didn't obey normal physical limitations, didn't acknowledge pain or exhaustion, and Corvus fought like he was trying young to tear reality apart with his bare claws, like Gregor had become the physical manifestation of everything that threatened his mate and therefore needed to be obliterated from existence. The battle was brutal and brief. Gregor's throat torn open, his body broken, and Corvus standing over him with black eyes and foam at his jaws. And for a terrible moment, Wren thought he'd turn on everyone present, that the feral state would consume him completely. She could see him trembling with the effort of maintaining even minimal control, could see the wolf inside him demanding more blood, more violence, complete elimination of all potential threats. "Corvus," she called, her voice weak from blood loss but carrying across the suddenly silent clearing. "I'm here. I'm alive. Come back to me." His head swung toward her, and she saw no recognition in those black eyes, saw only predator-assessing movement. And her newly awakened wolf whimpered inside her chest because her mate was lost, because the bond between them was screaming, but he couldn't hear it through the feral rage. She tried to stand, her wounded body protesting every movement, and took a step toward him despite the pack members trying to hold her back, despite the obvious suicidal nature of approaching a feral alpha. "It's me," she said, taking another step, her hand extended, everything she'd learned about wolf behavior and submission forgotten in desperate need to reach him. "Your mate, Renly, come back. I need you. Please come back." She watched him fight, watched the man inside struggle against the wolf that wanted to attack anything that moved. And she kept walking, kept talking in low, soothing tones about pack and safety and home. And when she was close enough to touch, she reached up slowly and placed her palm against his massive furred face, felt him tense, felt the potential violence coiled in every muscle. "Come back," she whispered. "I'm safe now. You protected me. You can come back." The shift was agonizing to watch, Corvus fighting back to human form while his wolf resisted, while instinct demanded he remain in the shape built for fighting and killing. When he finally collapsed to his knees in front of her, naked and shaking and himself again, his first coherent words were broken with emotion. "You're hurt. You're bleeding. I felt you dying. I felt..." His hands moved over her wounds with desperate gentleness, cataloging damage, and his eyes were amber again, but haunted, horrified by how close he'd come to losing her, by how close he'd come to losing himself. Ren's legs gave out, exhaustion and blood loss finally overwhelming adrenaline, and he caught her, pulled her against his chest, and she felt his heart hammering against her cheek, felt the tremors running through his body as the aftermath of going feral settled over him. Around them, the clearing was controlled chaos, Gregor's remaining wolves surrendering or fleeing, Corvus's pack securing the perimeter, and Marlowe arriving with a vehicle and medical supplies, her face set with determination that suggested she intended to earn back trust through action rather than words. She'd brought something else too, a metal case that she opened to reveal documents, financial records, signed orders bearing Gregor's seal. "I stole these from his study before confessing to you," Marlowe explained, kneeling in the dirt with submission absolute. "I was trying to play both sides, gathering evidence while following his orders, trying to save my brother while also giving you tools to defeat him. It was cowardice disguised as strategy, and I will accept whatever punishment you decree. But these documents corroborate everything the journal supposedly contains: territory theft, murder orders, financial corruption spanning decades." She pulled out her phone, showed coordinates. "And this is where he's keeping prisoners, including my brother. I'm prepared to lead the rescue personally as penance." Ren barely processed the words, her consciousness trying to gray at the edges, but she forced focus long enough to look at Gregor's dying form. He was laughing, blood bubbling from his torn throat, the sound wet and wrong. "You've won nothing," he managed, his voice barely audible. "The packs will never follow a resurrected bloodline and a king who goes feral. You're too dangerous, too unstable. Even in victory, you've lost." But pack members were recording on their phones. The modern era meant documentation was ubiquitous, and they'd captured Gregor's confession, his mocking admission of murder and theft, his complete lack of remorse. And more wolves were arriving, drawn by the commotion, witnessing the aftermath and the evidence. And Idris was there, suddenly, the ancient historian, announcing in formal tones that carried across the assembly, "I declare before assembled witnesses that Renly Silvercrest, daughter of Marcus and Thea, is the legitimate heir to Silvercrest territories and titles. I declare that the children known as Finn, Jory, Beck, Tansy, and Pip are under her protection and recognized as Silvercrest pack members. And I declare that Gregor Ironhide's claims and territories are forfeit under pack law, his crimes proven beyond contest. One by one, wolves began lowering their heads, first to Ren, acknowledging her as alpha, then to Corvus, reaffirming loyalty to their king. It was acceptance, was the political shift that happened when power changed hands and new order established itself. And even some of Gregor's former allies were bowing, reading the situation and adapting with survival pragmatism. Gregor died watching his empire crumble, his last expression twisting between rage and disbelief. And Ren felt nothing but hollow relief that he couldn't hurt anyone else, couldn't steal more childhoods or murder more families. "I need healers," Corvus said, his voice rough but controlled again, and he lifted Ren carefully, cradling her against his chest as he stood. Now. The children clustered around them, 5 blood-stained juveniles who'd survived against impossible odds. And Tansy was crying, asking in a small voice if Ren was going to die. And Ren managed to smile despite the pain radiating through every nerve. "No," she said, the word coming out slurred but certain. "Not after everything. Not when we finally won." She lost consciousness somewhere during the vehicle ride back to the fortress, her last awareness being Corvus's arms around her and his voice speaking urgently to healers, demanding they save her, threatening consequences if they failed, his control fracturing again at the edges, because even with the threat eliminated, his mate was wounded, and his wolf couldn't understand why he wasn't fixing it immediately. When awareness returned, hours or days later, time uncertain, she was in the bedroom she'd been assigned at the fortress, and Corvus was asleep in a chair beside her bed, his hand holding hers even in unconsciousness, his face haggard in a way that suggested he hadn't left her side since they'd returned. His eyes opened the moment she stirred, going from sleep to alert instantly, and the relief that flooded his expression was so profound it was almost painful to witness. "You're awake," he said, voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. "Finally. The healers said you'd survive, but you've been unconscious for 2 weeks, and I—" He stopped, jaw clenching. "If you ever sacrifice yourself like that again, I will tie you to me and never let you leave my sight." 2 weeks? Ren's voice came out as a croak, her throat dry. And he was already offering water, helping her drink with careful attention. "Your wounds were severe, and your body was still recovering from the awakening. They said you needed time to heal both traumas simultaneously." His thumb traced patterns on the back of her hand, the gesture unconscious and gentle. "The children have been checking on you constantly. Finn organized a rotation, so someone was always here when I had to attend to pack business. They've been worried." Worried? As if summoned by mention, the door burst open and 5 juveniles poured in, their relief at seeing her awake palpable and overwhelming. They climbed onto the bed carefully, mindful of her injuries, and Pip was crying again, and Jory was trying not to cry and failing, and Finn was explaining everything that had happened in her absence, the formal council that had cleared Corvus of all charges, the territories returned to Silvercrest, the wolves who'd pledged loyalty, the rescued prisoners, including Marlowe's brother. "And Gregor's wolves who survived have been sentenced," Beck added quietly. "Most are in custody, awaiting trial. Some pledged loyalty to you specifically as recompense." "The journal was in the vault after all," Tansy said, her quiet voice cutting through the chaos. "When Gregor dropped it during the fight, Finn grabbed it while everyone was distracted. Turns out it was real, not a fake. Gregor lied about having recovered it years ago. He was bluffing to break our spirits." They'd won, Ren realized. Despite impossible odds, despite her inexperience and their youth, they'd survived and won. And she felt tears tracking down her face, grief and relief combining into something overwhelming. Corvus gently shooed the children out after a few minutes, promising they could return later, and when the room was quiet again, he moved to sit on the bed beside her, his weight making the mattress dip, his proximity making the mate bond sing with contentment. "I thought I lost you," he said quietly. "When I felt you leaving through the bond, felt you heading into danger and couldn't stop you, it broke something in me. Going feral isn't a choice, it's a failure of control, and I've never failed like that before." "You saved us," Ren corrected. "You brought an army and saved us when we would have died." "Barely," he said, "and I almost didn't come back. If you hadn't reached me." He stopped, the words too terrible to speak. Ren reached up, touched his face, felt stubble rough against her palm. "But I did reach you, and we're both alive, and Gregor is dead. It's over." "No," Corvus said, but he smiled slightly. "It's just beginning." What the dawn brings. Recovery took 3 more weeks before the healers finally declared Ren strong enough for the physical demands of what came next. 3 weeks during which she learned to navigate her new reality with Corvus's patient guidance and the children's enthusiastic companionship. The fortress became less fortress and more home as she memorized its corridors and rhythms, as pack members shifted from viewing her as curiosity to accepting her as legitimate alpha. As the mate bond between her and Corvus deepened from instinctive recognition into something richer and more complex that involved actual knowledge of each other beyond biological imperative. She learned that he took his coffee black and too hot, that he had a scar across his ribs from a challenge fight when he was 19, that he'd been raised by his uncle after his parents died in the same purge that killed hers, that leadership was burden as much as power, and he carried the weight of every wolf under his protection with seriousness that sometimes kept him awake through entire nights. And he learned that she was stubborn beyond reason, that she had nightmares about the years she'd lost, that she sang off-key when she thought no one was listening, that her devotion to the 5 children who'd chosen her was absolute and non-negotiable. The Council of 7 Packs convened in formal session to address the aftermath of Gregor's death and the evidence of his decades of corruption, and the proceedings took days of testimony and deliberation. In the end, vast territories were redistributed, co-conspirators faced justice ranging from exile to execution depending on their level of involvement, and the Silvercrest lands, burned and abandoned for 15 years, were legally returned to Ren with full recognition of her status as alpha. She stood before the council, unsole in formal attire that Corvus had commissioned, silver and white that honored Silvercrest colors, and when they asked her intentions for rebuilding her pack, she'd looked at the 5 children standing with her and spoken words she'd been considering since awakening from her 2-week recovery. "I propose a merger," she said, her voice carrying through the council chamber with confidence that still felt new but was growing stronger daily. Silvercrest and Nightborn becoming one unified pack if Alpha King Corvus will accept the union. The chamber erupted in whispers and debates because pack mergers were rare and complicated, because combining 2 of the 7 founding bloodlines was politically significant, and because everyone recognized this was mate bond made political reality, personal choice becoming public declaration. Corvus stood from his position at the council's head, moved to stand beside her, and his voice was formal, but his eyes were warm when he responded. "The Alpha King accepts. Silvercrest Nightborn will stand as one pack, co-ruled, with all rights and territories combined and shared equally." The chamber erupted in whispers and debates because pack mergers were rare and complicated, because combining 2 of the 7 founding bloodlines was politically significant, and because everyone recognized this was mate bond made political reality, personal choice becoming public declaration. Corvus stood from his position at the council's head, moved to stand beside her, and his voice was formal, but his eyes were warm when he responded. "The Alpha King accepts. Silvercrest Nightborn will stand as one pack, co-ruled, with all rights and territories combined and shared equally." It meant negotiations and contracts and ceremonies, meant weeks of bureaucratic tedium that made Ren's head spin. But it also meant legitimacy that protected not just her, but the children, meant resources to rebuild, meant she didn't have to face the impossible task of reconstruction alone. The formal pack integration ceremony happened under the full moon in the ancient stone circle, and Wren wore regalia that mixed both pack traditions, the silver crown with moonstone that marked Silvercrest alphas, and the black leather and ceremonial weapons that signified Nightborn authority. The 5 children stood with her as her founding pack members, wearing new clothes that fit properly and expressions that mixed solemnity with barely contained excitement. Corvus performed the rites in the old language, binding their packs with blood oath and spoken promises, and when he threw the ceremonial blade across his palm and then hers, when their blood mixed and the magic sealed, Wren felt something settle into place that was larger than herself, larger than personal desire, a responsibility and belonging that stretched back centuries and forward into futures she couldn't predict. Pack members from both groups howled their acceptance, the sound carrying across the mountain and into valleys beyond, announcement and celebration, and warning to any who might challenge the new order. Later, when ceremony gave way to feast and the formal proceedings dissolved into something more celebratory, Corvus found her on the balcony where they'd first really talked, where he'd told her about her parents and promised protection regardless of her choices. He carried something wrapped in leather, handled it with reverence that suggested precious contents. "I have something for you," he said, offering the package. "We returned to the Silvercrest vault after you were injured. This was there, protected by preservation spells." Wren unwrapped it carefully, found a journal with her mother's handwriting on the cover. Not the evidence journal that had convicted Gregor, but something personal, a diary kept during Wren's childhood. She opened to a random page, saw words about teaching her daughter to hunt by moonlight, about pride and how quickly she learned, about hopes for the woman she'd become. "They loved you completely," Corvus said quietly. "Every page makes that clear. And they'd be proud of what you've become, of how you've protected those children, of the alpha you're choosing to be." Wren felt tears tracking down her face, grief for parents she'd barely begun to remember, combining with gratitude that she had these words, this evidence of their love. "Thank you for this, for everything. Thank me by never running into danger alone again," he said. But his tone was gentle, understanding that she'd do exactly that if her pack needed protecting. "My heart can't take it." She laughed, ugged, the sound shaky but genuine, and leaned into him, felt his arms wrap around her with the kind of security she'd spent her entire conscious life craving. The mate bond hummed between them, content and settled, and she realized with startling clarity that this belonging, this purpose, this love was what had been missing from all those years of hollow existence in the human world. "I want to try shifting," she said suddenly, pulling back to look at him. "Really shifting, consciously, not during combat or ritual, but because I choose to." He nodded, understanding. "It gets easier with practice. The pain lessens as your body learns the change. And running in wolf form," his expression became something almost reverent. "There's no freedom like it." They walked to the forest beyond the fortress walls, to a clearing where moonlight painted everything silver, and Wren stood in the center while Corvus stripped unselfconsciously and shifted, his massive black wolf appearing in the fluid transformation of someone who'd been doing this for centuries. He sat, waiting patiently, and Wren closed her eyes, reached for the wolf inside her that was no longer caged, no longer suppressed, and invited the change. It hurt, bones shifting, muscles restructuring, senses exploding into new configurations, but the pain was bearable, brief, and when she opened eyes that saw spectrum beyond human limitation, when she tested legs that moved with 4-point coordination instead of 2, she felt the rightness of this form, the way it fit her like coming home. Corvus approached, touched his nose to hers in greeting, and then he was moving, running through the forest with speed that made the trees blur. And Wren followed, her wolf learning instinctively how to navigate terrain at this velocity, how to leap fallen logs and dodge low branches, and the joy that filled her was pure and uncomplicated, was freedom from every constraint that had defined her human existence. They ran for hours, covering miles of territory. And when they finally stopped at a ridge overlooking valleys painted silver by moonlight, Wren threw back her head and howled, the sound carrying everything she couldn't articulate in words: grief and triumph, loss and discovery, the peculiar alchemy of being destroyed and rebuilt into something stronger. Corvus howled with her, and from the fortress behind them, their pack joined in, over 100 voices in harmony, and the sound was belonging made audible, was family and purpose and futures worth fighting for. The shift back to human was easier this time, her body learning the transformation's demands, and they stood naked in moonlight without embarrassment, because wolf culture didn't share human hang-ups about bodies, because pack meant being seen completely and accepted anyway. "I love you," Corvus said, the words simple but weighted with certainty. "Mate bond or not, choice or fate, I love you, and I will spend however many years we have making sure you never doubt your worth or your belonging." Wren touched his face, saw her own emotions reflected in amber eyes that had become her favorite color. "I love you too, even though you're bossy and overprotective, and you snore when you fall asleep in chairs because you refuse to leave my bedside." He laughed, the sound rich and unguarded, and kissed her with the kind of thoroughness that made her forget they were standing in a forest at 3 in the morning, made her forget everything except the taste of him and the feeling of his hands on her skin and the bond between them singing with perfect contentment. When they returned to the fortress as dawn painted the sky pink and gold, they found the 5 children asleep in a pile in Wren's quarters, having apparently decided that her absence required their protective presence. Corvus helped her carefully extract herself from the tangle of small bodies, and they stood watching the juveniles sleep with expressions that mixed amusement and affection and fierce protectiveness. They're ours now," Wren said quietly. "Really and legally ours. A pack of 7 that will grow, that will rebuild what was destroyed." "The beginning," Corvus agreed, pulling her close, "not the ending." In the weeks that followed, reconstruction began on the Silvercrest estate, not restoring what had been, but building something new that honored the past while serving present needs. Wren split her time between the fortress and the construction site, the children always nearby, and she learned leadership through practice and mistakes and Corvus's patient guidance. Idris pulled her aside one afternoon, his ancient eyes serious. "You should know that Gregor had allies we haven't fully identified. There will be challenges to your authority, attempts to destabilize the peace you've built, political threats, if not physical ones." "I know," Wren said, because she'd learned enough about pack politics to understand power vacuums attracted ambitious wolves, that defeating one enemy didn't eliminate all opposition. "But whatever comes, we'll face it, together." "Good," Idris said, and smiled with something that looked like pride. "Your parents would approve of the alpha you're becoming. Not perfect, but genuine. Not fearless, but brave anyway. That's all leadership requires." On a night 3 months after Gregor's death, Wren stood in the rebuilt garden of the Silvercrest estate, in the space where her mother had once grown moonflowers and sung pack songs. The restoration wasn't complete. Construction was ongoing. Scaffolding still surrounded parts of the main structure. But the garden had been her priority, and now silver flowers bloomed under moonlight, their scent carried on wind that whispered through pine trees. Corvus approached from behind, wrapped his arms around her waist, and she leaned into him, into the solid certainty of his presence. In the distance, she could hear the children playing, their laughter carrying through evening air, and the sound was healing, was proof that trauma didn't have to define futures, that stolen childhoods could still grow into healthy adulthoods given safety and love. "Having second thoughts?" Corvus asked, his breath warm against her ear. "About you? Never," Wren said, turning in his arms to face him. "About everything else? Daily. Leading is harder than I imagined. Everyone looking to me for answers I don't have, for wisdom I haven't earned." "You're doing better than you think," he said, "and you're not alone in it. That's what pack means, what mates mean. We carry the weight together." From the forest surrounding the estate, wolves began to howl, the evening song, the pack's way of marking territory and affirming presence. Wren and Corvus, still in human form, added their voices, and the sound rose together in harmony that spoke of unity and strength, of a pack reborn from ashes, of futures uncertain but faced together. Wren had spent 24 years hollow, empty, a shell of a person who didn't know what she'd lost or who she might have been. Now, standing in the garden where her mother had once tended flowers and taught her daughter about moonlight and magic, her mate's arms solid and warm around her, 5 orphaned children sleeping safely in the estate behind them, an entire pack calling her Alpha, she finally understood what it meant to be whole. The past would always carry scars. Some memories would always hurt to touch. Some losses could never be recovered. But the future stretched before her like the forest under moonlight, wild, unknown, full of dangers she couldn't predict and joys she'd never imagined. She wasn't the frightened girl who counted dollar bills in a dingy diner anymore, wasn't the hollow thing surviving between shifts and wondering why existence felt like slow drowning. She was Renly Silvercrest, alpha of her reborn pack, mate to the Northern King, mother to 5 fierce juveniles who chose her just as much as she'd chosen them. And for the first time in her broken, stolen, reclaimed life, she was home.